Welcome everybody, and welcome Congressman Larsen and Tia Larsen. Today is intended to be very informal. I think you all know Congressman Larsen and what an extraordinary job he did in creating the U.S. China Working Group now 7 years ago. 2005. Yeah. And we know he's in his 6th term, and every time I introduce him, I always use the same words, which whenever I spend time with him, it reinstills my faith in the American system, and I believe more in American politics after I spend 7 days traveling around, or 8 days, as the House Ethics Committee dictates, traveling around China with Rick. But today, our intention is to be very informal, which is why we've kept it to this room and this group, where Rick will just make a few comments, and then
I want to thank the National Committee for an opportunity to speak with you this afternoon, and as well as for dinner tonight, where some of us will get even a little more informal setting. It's a great opportunity for us, when I say us, for Tia, my wife, and I to come up to New York and spend some time with you and to share just some thoughts that I have about current thoughts about China. These ideas of continually evolve as a member of Congress for me, because having visited now there to China 7 separate times over the last 6 years or so, as well as the various meetings that I've been able to participate in here in the United States with Chinese leaders, with our own administration leaders under two administrations now, as well as business leaders in the U.S. And academics, and then the same kinds of folks in China. When you look at the totality of the 7 years, there's some things that have been stable, and there's some things that are changing. And I think just to jump right to the headline is that this year is, there's always a cliche in U.S. politics that this presidential election is the most important presidential election in the history of America. That's a cliche. Every election is that important. Well, I think in China, this selection that's taking place this fall is the most important selection that's taken place in the last 30 years. And it's because, I guess from my perspective, the economic engine known as the Chinese economy is slowing. It has slowed down somewhat. Most folks think it'll still grow at 8% this year, but whether it's going to see the days of 10, 11, or 12% a year again, there's some question about that. And there's also some question, frankly, in talking with a lot of these folks about whether it should and even can sustain that, given the current size of the economy, as well as the size of the population. As one person who watches this told me, it's the law of big numbers. You just can't grow at 10% a year every year forever. And so, do you need to do something here? Just go ahead. So the idea that China's economy grows at something less than 10% over the next 5 years and possibly over the next 10 years provides a challenge. Just hit the speaker there. Are you there?
Hello.
Yeah, great. Just hang up. There you go. Hi, it's Rick Larsen.
And in addition to the introduction, he's a technology wizard.
I just started my comments, and I was saying that this quickly, the selection this year of the new leadership is probably the most important in 30 years. Again, you're not going to have, at least from what I've initially talking to folks about the Chinese economy, you're not going to have that 10%, 11% growth every year over the next several years. You're going to see something closer to what it is now, and you may even see that growth rate drop over the next 10 years to something more in line with a developed economy that's growing quickly, as opposed to a developing economy that's growing slowly. So that's one of these things that is, I think, setting up the environment for the new leadership in China, and then as well what that means for U.S. policy, trade policy, economic engagement policy with China, given the closeness of our economies. The second thing I would point out that makes this a real important selection in China, again, this is from my perspective, is regional tensions, and that's a euphemism for the South China Sea. So long as mainland China and Taiwan continue on what they're doing, I don't know that there's a lot for the U.S. to be that concerned about it. I think it's certainly going to be always an area where we want to see stability. But the Center for Strategic and International Studies has a very interesting presentation using Google Earth, and it's to explain not just the overlapping sovereignty interests that exist in the South China Sea, but also the overlapping oil and gas lease interests in the South China Sea. So for those who have an interest in why the U.S. has such an interest in this area, it is not because of the existence of oil and gas that we're interested, that is directly for our economy. It's because of the overlapping interests there. Creates a potential for a lot of conflict, and that's not understating it at all. So this Center for Strategic International Studies presentation is, I think, real enlightening for somebody like me who's a member of Congress, who we've got a lot of things on our table, but to draw us a picture is about the best thing you can do for a member of Congress. And this presentation draws a very clear picture, not just about where the sovereignty claims are in terms of lines on a map, but also where the how those play out for the oil and gas lease claims as well. So it's not just a matter of reading in the news that there's that China and Vietnam have overlapping claims, but when you actually see the the leases that China itself is trying to the blocks that China is trying to lease out that Vietnam also claims, and where those are located, it becomes even more clear why this is a hot spot. So I think that the regional tension issue, and then I can go to North Korea separately, but the regional tension issue is an area where the new leadership is going to have to pay a lot of attention to. The third issue that I'm certainly looking at has nothing really to do with the United States, although everything does, right? It's not about the United States, and why do we pay attention to it? And this is something I try to convey to my colleagues in Congress, is that sometimes you have to pay attention to what's important to the Chinese when you're thinking about U.S. China relations. And for the new leadership, this issue of corruption and the credibility of the Chinese Communist Party is extremely important. And my guess, based on a lot of conversations I've had, is that this is probably where a lot of attention is going to be paid by the new leadership. That if you have an economy that is slowing, and you've got regional tensions, but you need leadership in a country to handle those things. And there seems to be, and this could be a very U.S. view of it, or it could be just a very Rick Larsen view of it, there seems to be a growing credibility gap between the Chinese Communist leadership, Chinese Communist Party leadership, and the people, broadly. How the Chinese leadership handles that over the next several years is obviously going to be very important for stability in China. It's going to be very important for the Chinese leadership. It's going to be very important for its economy. It's going to be very important for how Chinese foreign policy, that is, how they relate to other countries, is handled. Because if they're focused so internally on their own credibility problems, that could mean less engagement, or it could mean engagement that is designed specifically to divert from those internal credibility problems in China. And we need to be, in the U.S., I think as policymakers, need to be very aware of that dynamic playing out. And it's one thing to be, it's one thing as a member of Congress to be angry at Chinese leadership and angry at the Communist Party because they're communist. It's another thing to understand the dynamics taking place in the country so that we can have a legitimate and responsible policy response if in fact one is called for. So I think that's why I say this is probably the most important selection of the leadership over the next 30 years, because these issues are all kind of coming to a head, at least from my point of view, at close to the same time that a leadership transition is taking place. A leadership transition that could see, if it's a 9-seat committee, could see 7 new people on it. If it's 7 seats and not 9, it could see 5 or 6 new people. You're gonna have a whole new crop, not a lot of overlap from the previous 5 years on this new leadership team. And again, when you put that all together, for me, it causes. I just hope that U.S. policy does take into account these dynamics along with this leadership transition, so that we can continue a policy of engagement, but knowing of these dynamics taking place inside China. That's how I see it today, and I'm really looking forward to anyone around this table or on the phone changing my mind, or helping me see other parts of this relationship as well, and other things I ought to be thinking about. So with that, Steve, I didn't come here to talk for an hour. I came here just to speak for a little bit, but I wanted to give folks an opportunity to ask questions or to provide your own comments as well.
Wonderful. That's a great overview. Can I take it just back home for a little bit?
Sure.
And talk about congressional views towards China.
Sure.
In the national election and in a lot of local races, China has been ripped into. Governor Romney certainly has China as part of his, during the primaries at least, has China as part of his stump speech, that, the stealer of American jobs. There are a lot of local races where China has become an issue. So my question, how will that play out? What will be the implications of that in January of 2013? And then any prospect for some legislative action in this session relating to China?
The answer to the first question, I think, from my perspective, goes something like this. There are very few foreign policy issues that will be discussed during the presidential campaign, or even the congressional campaigns. One certainly will be Iran, U.S. and an international community as it relates to Iran. China has a part of that, but that's really more seen in an electorate about the U.S. And the West versus Iran. The second issue certainly now is Syria, and how Syria continues to play itself out. A third issue, and less so now, it's becoming more of an interesting soap opera right now, and that's North Korea. Something interesting to watch, unless UN does something with a missile or a test. The fourth, and this is in no particular order, obviously, the fourth is China. And China actually is the only foreign policy, the issue of U.S. and China relations is the only foreign policy issue that actually has a real direct overlap to economic issues in the United States that people do connect to. The price of oil and gas, or the price of gas at the pump with regards to Iran, tangential. North Korea, really no relationship. Syria, straight foreign policy. China, U.S. China relations is something that most folks see again. There's not just the foreign policy aspect of it, but there's the economic and trade aspect of it, what it means for United States jobs, what it means for United States trade policy. And I think you're going to, as a result, see that play out more so than other foreign policy issues in this campaign, not just at the presidential level. And you've heard Governor Romney talk about it. You've seen the president and the administration take trade cases at WTO, enforcement cases at WTO, and most of those found in our favor, by the way. So you're going to see it play out that way, and then you're going to see it play out locally too, even in congressional races. And probably not, I'll go on a limb here, probably not positively for an engagement policy between the United States and China. Shocked to hear that. So I think that that's a reality of elections in the United States this fall, and we'll need to get through that. I am hopeful that even the new Chinese leadership understands the need for the U.S. to get through that, and what that means in 2013 will probably be something less than what is actually talked about in the elections. As a result, I don't foresee any legislation actually being taken up in this session of Congress that would actually have any chance of passing. And that goes for any piece of legislation in this session of Congress. So much less legislation related to U.S. economic ties with China. So I think that has to play out. This is going to have to play out a little bit. We may see things along the edges. For instance, we have seen the last two budget cycles, small things that I have opposed, and we've been able to temper some of this. Things like not allowing the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House to do science exchanges with NASA, things like that. So things that are on the margins that we can fix or work around, but something big and bold, I don't see legislation. I wouldn't put it past. In fairness here, I'm a Democrat. There's not Charles Bustani would have loved to have been here. He couldn't be here today, and he would speak from a point of view that's slightly different, but not much. So I'll put it on both the president and Governor Romney. I wouldn't put it past both of them to say something, each of them to say something to out China each other at some point this fall. Possibly during the debate. We're going to have 3 debates scheduled. 2 will be on domestic, 1 will be on foreign policy. And my guess is that either of them will try to out-China each other in some way. But my advice to folks is always, take a deep breath. The election's almost over.
Going on a long time.
Yeah.
Let me just ask one more question and then turn it over, which is there any relationship, or what is the relationship between the fiscal cliff and U.S. China relations? In other words, how does this affect the relationship?
Yeah. I think that what Chinese leadership would say to U.S. economic leaders in the administration is the same thing that most other countries would say as well, and that's get your fiscal house in order and don't blow it. All right. For China, there's a little more skin in the game because of how many treasury securities they hold, but Japan holds many, Great Britain holds many, Germany holds many. They hold a lot of these instruments. And so none of these folks want to see that the value of those instruments devalued. So I don't want to isolate China on this, but this economic issue with the so-called fiscal cliff is an important one. The challenge we're facing in the Congress is to try to address this in a rational manner, in a balanced manner as well. I think that I would not say it's a majority within the Republican conference, but there's enough folks who are in the right positions in the Republican conference who are talking at least talking about the tax loopholes and tax exemptions, and how do you restructure that so that it cuts off that source of spending, what we call tax expenditures. The Democrats have a different view, obviously a little bit, want to do a little bit more on tax revenue, but also we need to think about spending cuts. The first thing to close the deficit, to shrink the deficit, is to grow the economy. That's the first thing that we have to do in the United States, and but we can't, unless we grow at 7% like the Chinese, we can't grow just the economy. And so going the rest of the way is a balance between, in my view, spending cuts and tax revenue. Not because anybody hates rich people or loves rich people or hates the poor or loves the poor. It's just the deficit number is so big year to year that you can't grow your way into shrinking the deficit in a demonstrable way. You have to include revenue and you have to include spending cuts. And that's the approach. And so I think the Chinese leadership and many other economic leaders in many other countries will be looking at Congress and the president to see how we are going to go about doing this in a balanced way. We are not going to shut the government down. It sounds like for instance, there is a deal to do a continuing resolution in our language, keep the government running, in DC language, keep the government running through March 31st at current spending levels. And we'll get into detail on what all that means. But essentially what it means is that problem won't be on our table. That won't be on the table. So we can focus strictly on the longer term deficit reduction package. I still have confidence in this great institution of Congress to get things done. It may not be done on my timeline. It may not be done on anyone's timeline here, but on the big things, the history of this country shows that we get the right things done.
Doesn't it begin January 1st? So the March 31st continuing resolution is 3 months late?
No. The fiscal year for the U.S. government starts October 1. So this would be a 6-month continuing resolution through March 31st. The question that we have to that I'm trying to get answered this week is, does that continuing resolution then change the sequestration rules so the sequestration doesn't kick in on January 1st? Right? It gives us that much more time to negotiate a longer term solution. But that's a question I have to answer still. I just don't have that answer yet.
Let me open the floor to. I've got 1,000 questions, but let me open the floor to other questions.
I'm trying to answer as succinctly as possible, and I'll do my best.
Doug.
It's refreshing to have a conversation like this without Taiwan being the first issue. But that also raises the unexpected eruption problem.
Yes.
The surprise. And I'm not going to ask about Taiwan, but rather about the South China Sea, because that issue has been on the table for 40 plus years, almost as long as Taiwan for American policy. And it seems that suddenly it is becoming a hot issue with the pivots. How do you see the South China Sea issue emerging now, and what are the challenges it could put to it?
I think that, well, to start, the ASEAN summit was 2 weeks ago, finished, and for the first time ever, there was not a communique or some sort of agreed upon statement, and that was in part not to blame my good friends in China, but it seemed to be in part because there seemed to be an effort to prevent a consensus document from coming out. And that they succeeded in preventing that from happening, on how to deal with some of these issues, and that's unfortunate for ASEAN, honestly. But I think the longer term issue about the U.S. rebalance is that we're responding in part to a demand signal in that region as well. I know the Chinese look at it as part of a we're trying to contain China. We're not going to contain China. You can't. And so it's kind of interesting to hear them talk about you're trying to contain us when we have not only no interest, but it's impossible. So why do you bring this argument up? Because it can't happen. But there is a demand signal from the Philippines, from Singapore, from Vietnam, from Australia, and many others, in part brought upon, I would argue in their view, in the view of these countries, brought upon China's attitude towards them. And so we're more than happy to accommodate for our own interests as well. We want good relations with Vietnam, with the Philippines, with Singapore, with all these countries. ASEAN. I met with ASEAN trade ministers 2 years ago in Seattle, who are coming through to talk about trade among ASEAN countries and how the U.S. can be more active in participating in that trade with these countries. So I would also argue that the rebalancing is really step 3. Diplomacy, trade, economic relations have been leading the way for us there, and the rebalancing of our military is sort of finally taking, for the U.S., finally taking sort of a whole of government approach to the region. I think that's a good way to look at it. With regards to South China Sea, again, here's an issue that where Secretary Clinton and Secretary Gates, before Secretary Panetta, and Panetta has said similar things. It's like we're about freedom of navigation. We're about open seas. If people want to drive through this, this open space, they ought to be able to do it and then not get harassed by it. On the same token, we're also about security and stability. And if folks are going to go to fisticuffs over natural resources in this area, that's not good for a lot of people, including the United States and including all of our neighbors and our interests. And so, if you want us to be part of solutions there, we're more than open to an invitation and to do that. But the Chinese formulation on this is shelve differences and jointly develop, and that's not a consensus position in that area.
Needless to say.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Right.
So looking at the rhetoric around the election, of course, China economy is the big one, but I wonder to what extent you see human rights playing into this, both on the presidential level. Of course, when the whole Chen Guangcheng brouhaha blew up, there was a lot of comments from the Romney camp, and then also on the congressional level, and I've seen when you look at the Congressional Executive Commission on China recently, it seems like their hearings have gotten more advocacy and slanted, I think, in some ways about who's appearing, and just
even more than before.
I was going to say even more than before.
Even more than before.
Oh,
I think that seems to be in the last year or two that they'll have 4 panelists, and they seem to be representing very similar viewpoints. But sort of what trends do you see on the human rights side?
Yeah. Well, I think the Chen issue has brought to the fore human rights issues like it's actually never been done before. And I think that the president can probably expect criticism within the campaign this fall on China, on economic and on human rights issues, and I think that the folks in the administration are big enough kids that they'll have an appropriate response. I mean, the fact is, for any criticism the president received, Chen and his family are not in China; they're in New York, and they are studying, and they've moved on from there. But I also think that Congress will continue to take a huge interest in human rights. And I tell folks, people know this formulation a little bit, and I know it's a little bit snarky, but there are factions in Congress, right? The panda huggers and the dragon slayers, and then there's panda slayers as well. Folks who are really extreme against China. There's a human rights faction, there's a national security faction, there's an economic trade faction, and I think that my personal view is that we really do have to take a multi-pronged approach to China, and focusing just on one aspect of that relationship is not hurts the whole relationship. Because I say there are many relationships we have with China. We do not have one. We have many relationships with China, and a good policy towards China tries to work all of those relationships. If there's just a focus on one, my guess is that you will hear about just one in the fall. Then we do that to the detriment of U.S. interest. So But you're going to hear about human rights, and you should, because human rights has been an important part of U.S. foreign policy since the late 1800s, early 1900s, and it'll continue to be a critical part. And the Chun case is just it's just one aspect of that human rights concern the U.S. has.
I'm just wondering, is bipartisanship dead? And when you look beyond the election, it seems to me there's still going to be red states and blue states no matter who wins the election and no matter what the balance is in Congress. It seems to me that our elected officials, with you as an exception, seem pretty much with blinders on and don't look at the complexity of the fabric between our two countries and seem to forget that they're holding the purse strings for our financial sovereignty or solvency. So I guess I'd like you to talk about how we, and I suppose it's larger than just the China issue, but China is absolutely critical to this, how we ever bridge the gaps between the panda huggers and the everybody, and how can you possibly be optimistic even after the election? Sorry.
Well, the answer to the first question, is bipartisanship dead? The answer is no. I can find Democrats and Republicans who hate China. So,
that's heartening.
On the other hand, it is not dead. Charles Bustani, again, who could not be here today, is a Republican, and we work quite well together on this issue and many other issues as a result of that. And last year, thanks to the National Committee on U.S. China Relations, we took a total of five members went to China last year. I forget who there were 2 Republicans and three Democrats, I think, last year. Is that right? Okay.
Yep.
Yeah. So and then in August, there's a bipartisan group of staffers going to China as well, thanks to the National Committee on U.S. China Relations. And so a bit of a commercial for the National Committee is that we work really hard to be sure that these groups that do go over are bipartisan, so folks see the same thing at the same time, as opposed to just read what they want to read in order to formulate their opinions. On the broader issues of bipartisanship and the challenges it poses for Congress, it isn't dead, but it is. It's frayed for sure. But there are many examples on many issues that are not high profile, and perhaps because they're not high profile, where members of Congress from both parties are working to get things done. But we do have elections, and elections matter for policy moving forward. And so members of Congress do respond to that. And I think that it's just some of this is we have to get it out of our system, I think, in this country, and some of it is trying to change the system a little bit. Part of the problem that I see, and not to criticize the media directly, it's just a matter of everybody's got their cable station, right? As I told someone, liberals watch MSNBC, conservatives watch Fox, and no one watches CNN. So when you have a niche cable market to hear only what you want to hear and agree with that, it makes it difficult to break through that. I try to let folks know that I don't watch a lot of that because it doesn't do me any good on most of the things I'm working on. So that's part of it. Redistricting has as well pushed folks into corners, especially in states where the legislatures control redistricting. There's probably room for reform there as well. But there's Norm Ornstein and Thomas Mann just did a book, it's called "It's Worse Than It Looks." I told them, getting to your optimism question, I told both of them, I said, you know what, I am just so optimistic about Congress and this great institution that there's no way in hell I'm going to read your book because I don't want to be depressed. But I read it. It's a great book. It's worth reading. But I would also say this about members of Congress. In their defense, you have to be both naive and idealistic to have this job. You have to be idealistic because even if you don't agree with the person's ideals that they're pushing, you have to want to do something, right? There has to be something you're after grabbing for. And you have to be naive, because if you believed you couldn't do it, you should not be in Congress, right? If you woke up every day as disappointed in Congress as most people are, it is time for you to get out of Congress.
Well, a lot of them are getting out.
And some are, but that's why that naivete it's a light naivete is important. You want people to believe they can get something done, even if you disagree with it. But then if you disagree with it, you've got to process elections to deal with that as well. And sometimes it's your time in history to be on the winning side, and sometimes it's your time in history to fight to get on the winning side.
Do you think the in the 1980s, there was considerable anti-Japanese feeling in the United States,
right?
And one of the kind of prongs that dealt with that was fairly massive Japanese investment into the United States in Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia, places like that, where Americans, it developed in effect a pro-Japan constituency within the United States, and congressmen and other political leaders, especially governors, paid a price for anti-Japanese rhetoric. As Chinese investment comes to the United States, you think we could possibly see an analogous situation?
There's a couple of factors that influence that. One is there enough? I mean, Chinese foreign direct investment in the U.S. is still less than 1% of total, right? So it's still not enough, and to make a broader impact. That's first. Second, is it strategic enough? The recent purchase of the commercial part of Hawker Beechcraft, I think, could be a real positive if folks talk about it. And we remember that we had when we were in Beijing or Shanghai last year, we had some of the young leaders, and there's the guy who invested in this company in Michigan, this
right.
auto parts company in Michigan.
Yeah, doesn't talk about it.
And we asked him, well, did you talk to the members of Congress of Michigan about how you saved 500 jobs and how you keep people at work? He goes, no, why would I do that? It's like, because it's an auto parts company in Michigan. That's why. But he didn't understand that the connection right. there. It's very important. So, what is it strategic enough to gain attention, and positive attention is another factor. A third factor is Japan is it's at least parliamentary democracy. It's a democracy, so that had that going for it in the U.S. And I don't want to disappoint you. China is not, yeah, shocking. So I think that the cultural value of, is this country an ally or a partner, or how do we already see this country, is still a hurdle to getting a nice shine off of foreign direct investment. Having said that, I also think it's important that this continues, because the investment dollars are investment dollars, and so long as there aren't strings attached, except for if I bought 51%, I get to call the shots, right? Then we ought to welcome that. We ought to, and private Chinese companies should be looking for those opportunities.
But there's going to be a CFIUS review of Hawker Beecher. You think there will not be an issue?
They only do the commercial side. The defense side is going to be separate. So I'd really question whether or not there's a lot of legs to that.
Congressman, Saudi Arabia is not a democracy either. It's a friend of ours. Disregard of that, I'd like to ask a question about immigration law. I'm a lawyer, and I think through engagement we'll meet more people that way. And there are two problems that I've been dealing with in the past since I became a lawyer over 24 years. The quota for each country is 20,000. So for a country of China, 1.3 billion, compared with European country, is 20,000 as well. So how can you treat the Chinese fairly, and they're waiting on the long line to come to America? And another question is for the immigration, like EB-5, people that can invest in this country, but they have to create 10 jobs. Now, I mean, that is a over the hoop. I have so many clients that wanted to come, but that becomes a scam because we have these regional centers where we have over 200 of them pre-certified. They put in the money, they get a temporary green card, and after 2 years, they don't get the permanent green card. And that's from the immigration that 45% of them don't get a permanent green card. Why? Because when you submit the plan, it's all good, but when the Labor Department comes in and audit and say, well, did you hire the proper people? Is it prevailing wage? Is it an investment? So a lot of people put in the money. I mean, can we make it simple? Say you invest this amount of money and you can come. And with these people who are doing very well in China, most of them doing very well, and they have a lot of knowledge, and we can absorb them. And if they become our friends, they can be a voice to bridge the two countries.
Yeah.
So these two questions. I know you're optimists, because the law.
I'm only an optimist because I don't quit. So
yeah, 20,000 quota. I mean, I even sent a letter to Senator Schumer, but he never returned my question. I'm a member of.
Take that up with Senator Schumer.
Founder of the Chinese American Bar Association. I asked him that question, and he never responded to my question.
On EB-5, this is something I spent a lot of time on because in my district we've been a great recipient of EB-5 investment.
Does everybody know what EB-5
is? You explained it pretty well.
Well, yeah, it's invest
$500,000.
Yes, and that's a regional center thing.
Yeah.
$1 million to create jobs. The $500,000 investment is for the depressed areas.
Yeah.
Or high unemployment rates.
And so the idea is that, and other countries do this. Canada is a competitor in this regard. UK is a competitor in this regard for us. And I would rather have those investment dollars since those dollars are leaving any of these countries. I certainly want them to come to the U.S. Instead of other countries. And so on EB-5, we've had a couple of successful regional centers do some work in my district. And so far so good there. Maybe you should look at my district instead of around here. That's my pitch.
Not very good. So people
in my district.
Oh, I'm not sure. About
yeah, well, that's. See, here's my point. Yeah. My point is that that it is important that we try to reform it, but and I'm open to that. It is very important as well, though, that the investment does create the jobs it's supposed to create. Absolutely. So if Department of Labor is doing an audit of things they shouldn't be auditing, that's fixable. If they're auditing things that they should be auditing, that it's probably less fixable unless they're applying those standards differently to different places. But if you want to give me further detail on some of your to the extent you're comfortable, individual.
Not my clients. They're good.
Yeah, great. Yeah, okay. Or other folks. I would love to hear. We've already have some folks from a couple of other districts in the country calling our office because we've been tracking this pretty closely. The second thing with the immigration law, I'll just say thanks for bringing it up. It's not the first time I've heard it, and
it's 20,000 for China.
Well, yeah.
So for 1.3 billion people, compared with some European countries where they have 4 million, 5 million, they have 20,000 also.
Yeah.
So it's just, I mean, just crazy.
Yeah. We need a broader immigration discussion in this country about on how we allocate quotas anyway.
Right. It should be based on country population.
I'll make a note of that.
Right? I mean, we do it fairly. I mean, as a lawyer, we always do pro rata, But we one man, one vote, right?
I got it. In charge of
some people are less.
Judge.
The growing concern, I think, in the Wall Street world, which I don't know if it's reached especially at your level, over the last, I think it's 2 years, 2.5 years, nearly 30 Chinese companies have been kicked off the New York Stock Exchange for lack of compliance and filing it. There's been a trend, I think, of these reverse IPO companies who want to been brought in, and I don't think there's an exact number as to how many of them were just, I think in my reading, it seems like a majority of them are just for lack of knowledge in the area. It's not like, have there been some indictments filed and investigations? Yes, but that blame has lied on both sides of the ocean, for lack of a better term.
Mm-hmm.
But has it come to the level of your body of Congress where that could cause some concern, because that could really quell continued Chinese investment, because you start to see that maybe the New York Stock Exchange or the SEC is going to, a couple of years ago, yeah, let's get some more Chinese investment. It's great, they're growing. And now they might want to say no, and I've also read where there are some Chinese companies saying, they're kicking us out, we don't want to go. We don't want to end up like the others being embarrassed.
Right.
Has that discussion come up yet?
No, it has not yet, and I think it might be early. It may be something that does over the next couple of years, though, rear its head more fully as other Chinese-based investment comes into the United States. These issues, I want to be careful here, because I don't know the individual cases here, and there's a couple articles you can point me to would be great. But if the issue is are these non-compliance issues, are they deliberate or not? It could be the growing pains of doing it, as well, and it's just a matter of folks learning how to do the right things right, so they don't get in trouble, and hiring the right folks to make sure it gets done right, so they don't get into trouble. It could be as simple as that. Unfortunately, the early bird is not getting the worm on this one, and that's maybe where that proverb falls down.
Yeah, some of it, just like anything, there's a percentage where there are people doing bad things. There's a percentage of people just being naive to the system.
Yeah.
And a lot of it goes to the due diligence and evaluation of the companies.
Oh, really? Oh, yeah.
The exchange of the information between a company that a U.S. company hiring a Chinese company saying, can you do the evaluation, and the exchange of the information just seems that it's a ripe area for almost a hand to be extended, where people grab hands and say, all right, let's just communicate. Let us teach you on how to come public in the U.S.
In the U.S.
If you want to do it, then this is the way you do it.
Yeah.
It seems to me that a large percentage of it could be cured by just an exchange.
Simple as that.
Information.
Yeah, capacity building.
Because my firm is the largest in the Chinese American community, so we handle a lot of these cases. And I think that China is not exactly a law-based society, so people do what works. So they hire this investor in investment firm to package them to be listed. So once when they are listed, when they go through the regulation, this is the learning curve, this is the growing pain.
Yeah.
So when they learn about that, they're going to change that internally in China. And that's why the laws in China are changing very fast. They are basically copying our laws, a lot of the laws. So, the first private law firm was established in China in 1992. So they have only 20 years of experience with rule of law. And the legal system is not independent, it's regulated by the state. So the judges do not have free hands. So it's going to be a long process. But this is a correction, I would say. So they're going to be very careful to come in again. So with the investors knowing that they're going to have problem with these packaging, and then when the SEC start looking into it, they'll learn.
There may be a lesson from the CNOOC debacle that took place in 2005, which led to the creation of the U.S. China Working Group. A few months after the CNOOC, the CCPIT folks were visiting Washington, D.C., the Chinese Committee on Promotion of International Trade. Is that close enough? And I asked the president of that group at the time, what did you learn from CNOOC? Was it that you shouldn't invest in the U.S.? They said, no, it wasn't that. So what we learned from CNOOC is that we need to learn your system better and maybe take it a little bit slower. And so I think there's probably a lesson to be learned from that in this situation, not knowing more of the details. But if you see some folks doing it wrong, you probably, as a result, in the future, will see more folks doing it right. Be my guess. As well as seeing bad actors. Bad actors need to get whacked.
Yeah. Anita.
Congressman, is the Congress concerned that the difference of views between China and Japan on Diaoyu Islands is going to impact on U.S. China relationship?
Senkakus for those who
Senkakus, yeah, I was gonna say, what's the Japanese name?
who sit in Japan.
That's right.
Not for this office.
We're neutral here,
Not
right?
for us.
Yeah, well. It is certainly it's an issue that obviously Japan brings up with the U.S. I mean, they're a treaty
Wanna buy
ally.
it.
Well, they're a treaty ally. They're a partner, a huge economic partner. But not knowing the exact position of the administration, so I won't speak for the administration. I never do. They wouldn't allow it anyway. But or for Congress for that matter. But I think that the principle that we would follow is stability, diplomacy, negotiation in a situation like that. Just don't make us pick what name to call it.
But is the Congress concerned about this?
This is not as big a concern as South China Sea issues generally.
Did you see today?
But I would note that I would not want you to report back and say Congress is not concerned about this issue.
Did you see the letter in the Wall Street Journal?
No.
There's a letter from
Yes.
some right-wing Japanese folks asking the United States to please pay attention to this and trying to get the United States more involved in this issue.
Backing for buying the islands.
Yes.
I think it's fair.
Would that come out of our general fund?
That's right.
I don't know.
I think it's fair to assume the administration is non-publicly telling the Japanese to stand down. That this is not an issue that the United States wants to deal with in 2012 or any time in the foreseeable future. And the status quo worked fine, and nationalization is not in America's interest. Fred.
Steve Orlins. That was Steve
That's
Orlins.
Steve Orlins' view. Congressman can't say that.
Congressman, you mentioned Sino, so Sino
Yes.
is in the news again. They're buying a Canadian company,
Right, yeah.
Nexen, which
Yeah.
has a 10% operation in the United States. Senator Schumer is
Oh.
asking for a CFIUS
That's it, right,
review. And
What's the name of the Canadian
Nexen,
company?
NEXEN.
Nexen. Yeah.
15.1 bill.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
So, but this time they hired 2 lobbying firms. They have,
I'm
they
sure they'll
have
be
go
fine.
to CFIUS ask for review. I mean, voluntarily. I mean, so I'm just wondering how does Congress looking at this deal?
Congress isn't looking at this deal yet. So it's buying Nexen to get obviously their hands on development of the oil sands, and whether or not that means they want to bring all that to Asia or not, I don't think I don't think they will. It's a global market, but the idea that 10% of the 10% of the operations of the company or the revenues generated out of U.S. operations. Do you recall? Yeah. I guess in my view, 10% of that business's operations in the U.S. is nowhere near 10% of the operations of oil and gas business in the U.S. In other words, it's a very tiny piece of any oil and gas operations in the U.S.
They want to.
Well, if again, I'm not one to give an opinion on what they should do with a company when they buy it, or even before that. But will Congress do? I don't know that. Natural resource politics, especially as it relates to Chinese-based companies and state-owned companies buying resources, it does cause eyebrows to raise in Congress. It really does. But I think that my personal view is that, especially when it comes to oil, it's a global commodity, it's a global market, and despite what anybody at CNOOC or Sinopec believe, there's no way that they're going to be able to control the price or where that stuff goes. The stuff's going to go where the price is going to be paid for it. And so gas is different. Natural gas is different because it's not global market. We haven't learned how to ship it globally freely everywhere yet, or we're not willing to. So will it be looked at? It probably will. There are probably some members of Congress who have a concern about that, depending on where their operations in the U.S. are located, frankly.
But I'm sorry, I mean, since you mentioned gas, so fracking is not going to solve our gas, petroleum need issue?
Fracking will not solve our petroleum issue, no. Right now what's happening in the U.S. is because of the success of hydraulic fracturing, we actually have a huge glut of natural gas sitting all over the United States waiting for somebody to use it. The smart person, the smart company, AT&T is converting their entire vehicle fleet to natural gas in order to try to take advantage of that. And so I think over time, and then UPS or one of the delivery groups is doing natural gas as well. Over time, that price is going to of natural gas in the U.S. is going to have to come up for one or two reasons. It can't sit there and not get used. And so folks are going to buy it. That'll bring the supply down eventually, which will bring the price up. Or we'll eventually get around to building the infrastructure that allows the export of natural gas. And there's people in Congress who want to stop that from happening as well, because of the concern about liquefied natural gas terminals being built. And so there's some politics around that. But I just think that I think natural gas prices will eventually creep back up. But they're creeping back up from extremely low, which is great for consumers who use natural gas. But in a market, someone's going to find a way to use that natural gas, and that's going to bring the price of it up. There's no way it can't be used.
Peggy, last question.
Thank you. We've talked a lot about how the Chinese are beginning to or need to learn more about how to operate in the U.S. system. And I wanted to talk a little bit about, hear your views on how we get more Americans, the next generation of American China experts. And actually the Chinese government is putting quite a lot of money to try to attract American students to China. And the U.S. side, due to the budget cuts, has actually cut U.S. investment in supporting American students in China, both Department of State, Department of Education. I know in this climate it's going to be a tough sell, but do you see any congressional interest in making sure that we know how to train the next generation of China experts?
Well, if you want to develop the next generation, don't send them to Congress.
No, but I want congressional money to send to China.
Second, I've talked to, as recently as, about 10 days ago, talked to Kurt Campbell about this and the 100,000 Strong initiative.
Yeah, we should have no money.
It has no State Department money, and probably won't.
Right.
And so I don't know. It's just a matter of continuing to try to raise that money, explain to people why it's important, and get them involved financially with this for the long term. Because the flip side is, the flip side of this is that, going to Sichuan University last year and speaking with students there, and we asked them why you learn English, and they kind of looked at us like, what are you, idiots? Why we learn English? Everybody talks English. Everybody speaks English. So if we want to do business in this world, we need to learn English. And so if that's the case, then why do we need to learn Chinese? Right? That's kind of and so we have to kind of get folks over that hump. It's not just a matter. I would argue that the young adults who are learning English and Chinese are learning English. And I would argue that in the United States, kids who are learning Chinese are learning China, which is probably much more valuable to learn China and Chinese as opposed to just learning English. Because I don't think the kids in China are learning anything about America, about the United States, except when they see us. The cultural aspect is as important. Otherwise, you're just speaking Chinese. I mean, I can speak Chinese, barely, not very well, but I think I know a lot more about China because I'm learning about China, and not very much. Don't test me. I mean, I'm speaking Chinese. So I think that it's important to take the tack that we're trying to do more than just teach kids Chinese and go to China to learn Chinese. It's more about learning cultural norms, about how to do business, about how to do pleasure, about how to do, how to do anything, as opposed to just learning the language. And that's a better selling point. Because if you're a global business, if you're a U.S.-based business, you want to do business in China, that's important to know. It's much more important to know.
But I'm sure you know that all of the area studies support is cut out of the Department of Education, State Department's cut back its building funds. I mean, all the things that, I agree with everything you said, but the money isn't there to back the logic.
Well, I'm not here to, I got a $1.2 trillion deficit this year.
Yeah. Yep.
And for the first time ever, if we do sequestration, Snohomish County Senior Services, where I live, will have to do a waiting list for Meals on Wheels. And 10,000 fewer meals will be delivered to seniors in 2013 in Snohomish, in one county, in my state alone. And these are folks who, for some of these folks, it's the only time someone comes by during the week at all. And so, as we're looking at balancing the interest and getting to a more sustainable federal budget, there are things that are going to come and things that are going to go. I'm not suggesting what you're saying goes. I'm just saying that
it gets on a long list.
The list is long. The list is long, which is why I think we need to take a more balanced approach to how we achieve a sustainable budget.
Could I just add a little thing about optimism?
I'll leave it to Steve.
About students? I promise, real quick. I used to be a news reporter, so I'll do 30 seconds or less.
30 seconds.
1987, I took 17 boys aged 10, 11, and 12 to play soccer in our sister city of Shanghai from San Francisco. We raised the money ourselves. We got Cathay Pacific to give us a huge discount on the kids. And, in California where I live, we've got this problem with our state parks, which are being closed for budget reasons. Citizens are getting together and through nonprofit organizations are keeping parks open. I think we're not going to be able to depend on State Department, Education Department, and so forth. And so there's got to be a new dynamic where we really do pull the oar, because we know how important this is. Those kids, when they came back, had an appreciation of a new culture. And in 1989, when Tiananmen happened, their parents told me those kids were glued to the television set because they cared. They had exchanged their muddy T-shirts with Chinese. So what I'm saying is, let's look at the glass as half full, not half empty, even though it's a big, tall glass.
Yeah.
We need to close here, but as I started off this program, I said that spending time with Rick always reinstills my faith in the American political system, and I think in this hour you have heard why. But thank you for joining me.